James Rivera had learned not to trust first impressions. After 5 years as a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, he knew that every smiling face in an old photograph had survived something that would have broken most people today. Still, nothing prepared him for the morning of September the 12th. James Rivera had learned not to trust first impressions. After 5 years as a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, he knew that every smiling face in an old photograph had survived something that would have broken most people today. Still, nothing prepared him for the morning of September the 12th, 2024. A plain cardboard box sat on his processing table, postmarked Richmond, Virginia. The return label read, "Estate of Dorothy L. Hayes, 1927, 2024. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue, lay a single cabinet card photograph mounted on heavy cream stock. The photographer's imprint along the bottom read, "Anderson Sons Photography, established 1885. Richmond, VI." Two young men stood side by side against a painted backdrop of bookshelves and velvet drapery. Both wore identical dark three-piece suits, crisp white shirts, and patterned silk ties. Their shoes gleamed, their hair was neatly parted. The man on the left, white, early 20s, light brown hair, the beginnings of a proud mustache. 2024. A plain cardboard box sat on his processing table, postmarked Richmond, Virginia. The return label read, "Estate of Dorothy L. Hayes, 1927, 2024. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue, lay a single cabinet card photograph mounted on heavy cream stock. The photographer's imprint along the bottom read, "Anderson Sons Photography, established 1885. Richmond, VI." Two young men stood side by side against a painted backdrop of bookshelves and velvet drapery. Both wore identical dark three-piece suits, crisp white shirts, and patterned silk ties. Their shoes gleamed, their hair was neatly parted. The man on the left, white, early 20s, light brown hair, the beginnings of a proud mustache, rested his right hand on the shoulder of the man on the right. Black, same age, strong jaw, intelligent eyes that stared straight into the lens. The black man's left hand reached across and gripped the white man's forearm in return. A Bible and a vase of lilies sat on a small table beside them. It was, on the surface, the most astonishing interracial portrait James had ever seen from Jim Crow, Virginia. 1889. 24 years after Appomattox. Studio portraits were declarations of status, and this one screamed equality. James's first thought was joy. Here was proof that friendship could survive even the worst of times. His second thought came when he flipped the card over. In hurried brown ink, someone had scrawled across the back, "Thomas and Marcus, the last photograph before the departure. May God forgive us for what we have done. The 14th of September, 1889. The words landed like a slap. The last photograph before the departure. Departure to where? And why ask divine forgiveness for something already done? He turned the card back over and reached for his loupe. Under 10x magnification, the illusion cracked. Thomas's fingers were not resting. They were digging into Marcus's shoulder, knuckles pale. Marcus's smile was rigid, the kind that never reached the eyes. His right hand, the one not gripping Thomas's arm, was clenched into a fist so tight the tendons stood out, and in the lower right corner of the backdrop, half hidden behind the table leg, hung a thick iron chain painted the same muted brown as the wainscoting, so the eye would slide right past it. James felt the temperature in the lab drop 10 degrees. He photographed every inch of the card, front, back, edges, then locked the original in a climate-controlled drawer. By noon, he was on the phone with Dr. Patricia Okoye at Howard University. "Pat, I need you in Richmond tomorrow. Bring every favor you have at the Library of Virginia." Patricia arrived before he did. They requested every box for Henrico County, 1865, 1895, land deeds, labor contracts, court filings, coroner's reports, newspapers on microfilm. By late afternoon, they had the first thread. 1880. U.S. Census, Henrico County, Oakwood Plantation. William Whitmore, 37, planter. Elizabeth Whitmore, wife. Thomas Whitmore, son, age 13. Marcus, 13, race, colored. Occupation, servant, no surname recorded. Same household, same ages. 13 years later, they would pose in identical suits for a photograph that begged God's forgiveness. Patricia found the post-emancipation labor contracts next. Year after year, Marcus, now listed as Marcus Freeman, signed or marked with annex agreements that bound him to Oakwood Plantation for wages that never quite covered the debts William Whitmore claimed he owed for room, board, clothing, and care during the transition from slavery to freedom. Each contract rolled over into the next. Classic peonage, illegal after 1867 but almost never prosecuted in Virginia. The contracts ended abruptly in 1885. Then on September the 10th, 1889, 4 days before the photograph, 2 court filings appeared within hours of each other. William Whitmore v. Thomas Whitmore complaint alleging his son was attempting to steal human chattel unlawfully retained. Thomas Whitmore v. William Whitmore counterclaim accusing his father of maintaining illegal peonage contracts and submitting evidence of fraud. No trial was ever scheduled. No further documents existed. On October 4th, 1889, the Richmond Dispatch printed a brief obituary. Thomas William Whitmore, age 23, only son of respected planter William Whitmore, died Tuesday evening from an accidental rifle discharge while cleaning his gun. Service is private. Patricia closed the microfilm reader and looked at James. His father murdered him, she said quietly, 3 weeks after Thomas tried to free Marcus and exposed the whole system. James stared at the photograph on the light table. The clenched fist, the death grip on the shoulder, the chain in the background. Thomas and Marcus had known exactly what was coming when they walked into Anderson Sons that September afternoon. They had dressed alike, posed as equals, and left a message for history in the only language the future might still be able to read. James felt the weight of 135 years settle on his shoulders. Marcus had escaped. That much was almost certain. No death record, no prison record, no mention of a lynching. Somewhere beyond Virginia, Marcus Freeman had walked out of the frame of that photograph carrying whatever evidence Thomas had managed to give him. James's job now was to follow the trail north and find out if the truth had survived. James flew to Philadelphia the next morning. He had spent the night chasing Marcus Freeman through digitized church rolls, city directories, and the Philadelphia Tribune archives. The trail began in 1891, 2 years after the photograph, when a 24-year-old carpenter from Virginia named Marcus Freeman was admitted to First Baptist Church on Lombard Street. By 1895, he owned a house and a shop. By 1900, he employed 3 journeymen. By 1902, he was testifying before Congress. The congressional testimony was the key. James printed all 15 pages and read them on the train, the words burning holes in the paper. Marcus had spoken plainly. I was held in bondage at Oakwood Plantation, Henrico County, Virginia, from 1866 until September 1889 by fraudulent debt contracts. Thomas Whitmore, the son of my former owner, discovered the fraud in 1888. He gathered proof and filed suit against his own father to free me and 3 others. On the 2nd of October 1889, the same day Judge Chambers signed my release, Thomas Whitmore was shot dead in his father's study. I saw him fall. His last words to me were, "Run, Marcus. Papers, desk, run." William Whitmore and Sheriff Crawford declared it an accident. I took the court order and the evidence Thomas died to give me and walked north until Virginia was behind me. Marcus had carried everything: the signed release, Thomas's affidavit, copies of the fraudulent contracts, and a second print of the cabinet card with Thomas's handwritten note on the back. "If something happens to me, use this evidence to prove the truth. Your friend always, Thomas Whitmore, the 14th of September, 1889. James closed the file and stared out the window at the passing Delaware countryside. Thomas had known he was signing his own death warrant. He had done it anyway. In Philadelphia, Dr. Alicia Freeman, Marcus's great-great-granddaughter and a retired history professor, met James at 30th Street Station. She was tall, silver-haired, and carried the same strong jaw James had seen in the 1889 photograph. "My grandfather, Marcus II, used to make us memorize parts of the story," she said as they walked to her car. "He said, 'Never forget the white boy who died so our blood could run free.' We thought it was family legend. Turns out it was just waiting." She drove him to a modest row house in West Philadelphia. In the dining room, 5 archival boxes waited on the table, the same boxes Dorothy Hayes had kept in Richmond until her death. Alicia opened the first one herself. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth yellowed by time, lay the originals Marcus had carried north in 1889. The court order dated the 2nd of October, 1889, freeing Marcus Freeman and awarding $500 in back wages. Thomas Whitmore's 23-page affidavit, written in a clear, furious hand. A bundle of fraudulent labor contracts, each marked with Marcus's X and William Whitmore's elegant signature. And, on top, the second cabinet card, identical to the one James already had, with Thomas's note in ink, now faded to rust. Alicia lifted the photograph with reverence. "They stood in that studio knowing one of them might not walk out of Virginia alive," she said, "and they still dressed the same, still touched each other like brothers. That's what my grandfather wanted us to remember." James photographed every page under controlled light. Then he opened the second box. Marcus's private diary, 1890-1935, lay there, bound in cracked leather. The first entry, dated the 15th of January, 1890, was written in careful, newly learned script. "I am free. Thomas died to make it so, and I will not waste the gift. Today I bought a plane and a square. Tomorrow I begin building." Later entries were fuller, richer. The 14th of September, 1895. 6 years since we posed for the picture. I keep it on my desk. When customers ask who the white boy is, I tell them, "That is the man who owns my freedom. He paid with everything he had." The 2nd of October every year carried the same line. "Thomas should be 40 today. I taught little Thomas to read by candle tonight. The debt is paid forward." James's eyes stung. He kept turning pages. In 1902, Marcus had added a pressed violet to the entry, written the night before he testified in Washington. "If they hang me for telling the truth, let it be known I died freer than I ever lived in Virginia." They never hanged him. Instead, Congress cited his testimony when it finally strengthened anti-peonage laws in 1903. Too late for Thomas, but not too late for thousands of others. The third box held letters Marcus wrote to his children but never sent. "Too painful," Alicia explained. One, addressed to his eldest son, Thomas Freeman, in 1929, read in part, "When you are tempted to hate all white people, remember one who stood in a Richmond studio in 1889 and said, 'We are equals.' When you are tempted to believe the law will always fail us, remember the judge who signed my freedom the same day Thomas died. Courage is rare, but it is real. Carry it like a torch." By the time James closed the last box, the sun had set. Alicia poured coffee neither of them tasted. "My family kept these papers for 135 years, she said. "We didn't know why they mattered. We just knew they did." James told her about the exhibition he wanted to build. 1 photograph, 2 lives, One murder, one escape, and a promise kept across 4 generations. Alicia didn't hesitate. Do it. Let Marcus and Thomas finally stand in the light together, equals again the way they meant to be. 3 weeks later, James flew to Alexandria to meet Robert Whitmore, William Whitmore's great-great-grandson and a retired federal judge. He laid the affidavit on the table between them. Robert read his ancestor's confession, Thomas's clear denunciation of his own father, in silence. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. "My family told a different story," he said. "They said Thomas died cleaning a gun. They never mentioned Marcus, never mentioned peonage. They buried the shame so deep they buried the honor with it." He touched the cabinet card. "This boy, my blood, chose right when choosing right was fatal. I want to help tell his story, the real one." 6 months later, on the anniversary of the photograph, the 14th of September 2025, the museum opened its new exhibition. They called it Equals Before the Lens. Thomas Whitmore, Marcus Freeman, and the Price of Friendship in Jim Crow's shadow. The centerpiece was the original cabinet card under museum glass, lit so every clenched knuckle, every painted chain link, every frightened eye was visible. Beside it, in Thomas's handwriting, blown up to wall size, "We stand as equals here, as we should stand under the law." Visitors entered through a narrow corridor lined with the fraudulent contracts. They emerged into a bright gallery where Marcus's tools, his business ledgers, his children's photographs, and his congressional testimony showed what freedom, once truly won, could build. At the exit stood 2 chairs facing each other, simple oak, handmade by Marcus Freeman in 1898. Visitors were invited to sit, to look across the space Thomas and Marcus had once occupied, and to ask themselves what they would have done in 1889. On opening day, Alicia Freeman and Robert Whitmore stood together beneath the photograph. Cameras flashed. Someone asked Robert if it was difficult to stand next to the descendant of the man his ancestor had murdered. Robert took Alicia's hand. "No," he said. "It feels like family finally coming home." Behind them, the 2 young men from 1889 looked out from the glass, no longer hiding their fear, no longer asking forgiveness for the crime of seeing each other as human. They had waited 136 years to be seen clearly. Now, at last, the lens had caught up to their courage. Opening day of Equals. Before the lens broke every attendance record the museum had ever set. By noon, the line stretched around the block, past the Washington Monument, reflecting in the tidal basin. Inside, the air felt different, quieter than usual, as though the building itself understood it was holding something sacred. James stood near the exit, watching strangers become witnesses. A group of high school students from Anacostia crowded around the display of Marcus's 1890 diary. Their teacher read aloud the entry Marcus wrote the day he bought his first plane and square. "I am free. Thomas died to make it so, and I will not waste the gift." One of the boys, tall, hoodie half-zipped, stared at the photograph for a long time. "So the white dude really died so the black dude could live?" he asked, voice low. "Yes," James answered. "And the black dude lived 70 more years, making sure nobody forgot the white dude who did it." The boy nodded slowly, then took a picture of Thomas's note on the wall. "We stand as equals here, as we should stand under the law." He set it as his phone lock screen without another word. In the next room, Alicia Freeman and Robert Whitmore, now co-chairs of the exhibition's education fund, gave joint talks every hour. They had become unlikely friends, bound by 2 young men who had refused to be enemies 136 years earlier. During the 2 p.m. session, an elderly white woman raised a trembling hand. "My maiden name was Whitmore," she said. "I grew up hearing Thomas died in a hunting accident. I came here ready to be angry. Instead, I'm proud and ashamed and grateful. She looked at Alicia. "Thank you for keeping him alive." Alicia smiled through tears. "Thank you for letting him be more than a ghost in your family." That evening, after the museum closed to the public, the Freeman and Whitmore descendants gathered in the gallery for a private ceremony. Alicia placed a small wooden box on the pedestal beneath the photograph. Inside lay the original plane Marcus had bought in 1890, worn smooth by decades of honest work. Robert added a single white camellia from the garden of the house in Alexandria that had once belonged to William Whitmore's brother. Then Alicia's 12-year-old great-grandnephew, Marcus Freeman V, stepped forward. He carried a new tool, a gleaming steel square freshly made in his grandfather's workshop. He laid it beside the old plane. "My granddad says every house needs a true corner," the boy announced, voice cracking only a little. "Thomas and Marcus started this one. We're just keeping it square for whoever builds next." He looked up at the photograph. "We got you," he told the two young men, frozen in 1889. "You can rest now." Robert Whitmore, former judge, voice of Virginia establishment families, began to sing softly, first alone, then joined by every Freeman in the room. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." When the last note faded, Alicia turned to James. "Take the exhibition on the road," she said. "Richmond first, then every state that still teaches kids slavery ended in 1865, with no questions asked. Let Thomas and Marcus walk into every classroom the way they walked into that studio, side by side, unafraid, telling the truth." The tour launched 6 months later. Richmond, 2026. The old Anderson Son studio building, now a boutique hotel, agreed to host the exhibition for one night only. On the exact spot where the photograph was taken, the cabinet card was displayed under soft light. Descendants of the photographer's family, who had never known the story, stood in the same doorway their ancestor had used, reading Thomas's affidavit aloud to a crowd that filled the street. Atlanta, Birmingham, Jackson, Little Rock, every city where peonage had worn a different mask. In Memphis, a white state senator who had once voted against removing Confederate statues stood in front of the photograph for 20 minutes, then quietly introduced legislation to fund statewide teaching about post-emancipation forced labor systems. In Charleston, a group of middle schoolers started a fundraiser to buy every public school library a copy of Marcus Freeman's congressional testimony. By 2028, the exhibition had visited 32 cities, over 4 million visitors, hundreds of thousands of students. Countless phone screens still carried Thomas's words as lock screen reminders. And then, on the 10th anniversary of the discovery, September 14, 2034, the museum made its final addition to the permanent gallery. 2 chairs remained, the ones visitors had been sitting in for a decade, but now a brass plaque was affixed to the wall between them. In memory of Thomas William Whitmore, 1866-1889, and Marcus Freeman, C.1866, 1935, they asked for nothing but justice. They received each other's lives. May we be worthy of what they built together. Below the plaque, a single line was added in 2034, engraved after a vote by every living descendant of both men. "The corner is square. The torch is passed. Keep building." James Rivera, now gray at the temples, stood in the gallery on the last night of his tenure before retirement. The lights were low, the museum empty. He looked up at the photograph one final time. Thomas and Marcus stared back, no longer afraid, no longer asking forgiveness. They looked, for the first time in 145 years, at peace. James placed his hand on the glass over their joined hands. "Thank you," he whispered. "We finally learned how to see." Outside, Washington's cherry blossoms were falling again, soft and white and endless. Inside, two young men from 1889 stood equal before the lens and before history, forever. The photograph had testified. The truth had walked free. And the corner, at long last, was square.